Let's compare reliability between Toyota, which is known for long-lasting cars that are easy to maintain and low cost of servicing and maintenance, or Mercedes-Benz, built in Germany and clearly has a strong reputation of historical vehicles that have made it over 500,000 miles. We're going to discuss some of the details that impact each one of these manufacturers' reliabilities, their current rating, why that is, and you might even be shocked when you hear the results. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. So before we get to the ratings, let's do a quick comparison. We'll have a look around. We'll check at the fit and finish of the exterior, the interior. We'll do a cold start and we'll do a quick quality experience of the two, and I'll summarize this whole conversation and we'll talk about why each one is rated the way it is, and we'll share those ratings at the end. First, let's take a look at the Mercedes-Benz. Take a listen. A few squeaks and rattles there. Now we look at body panels, are quite tight. Everything fits very nicely. They've got lots of great panel fitment. Although, when you look over here, we have a panel here that doesn't fit all that well, right here. The rims are nice there, but this, kind of a little floppy right there. You have great detail on some of the tail lights here. Lots of great fitment, and all the panels are very, very snug. Mirrors feel fairly snug. Trim is nicely put together, doesn't feel like it's kind of come off anywhere. All the trim around the doors feels very snug as well. Everything feels very well put together from the outside perspective, other than a few of these body panels where they fasten up to the metal, plastic to metal fitment. This actually came apart for us. On this Mercedes, when we hit a set of railroad tracks, that panel actually popped loose. We had to take back to the dealer to get it retightened. But let's take a quick look at the Toyota right here. You can hear a little squeaky there too, and you see the whole panel moving. You can see the whole bumper kind of just shaking a little bit there. Then we look over here. Panel gap here is a little wider, so they fill it in with a rubber gasket here. I see a lot of great panel gap here as well, very similar to the Mercedes-Benz. The mirror, slightly looser, doesn't feel quite as solid right here. Now some of this trim here looks a little bit more basic, as you can see, kind of cut off. Very simplistic, they don't get as detailed. A lot of the trim is a little bit more generic looking. They don't use as fancy finishing in material areas like that. Now we look down here, the wheels are nice quality. And how about this? This feels like there's a little more behind it. Feels like there's a little bit more insulation, and this tends to feel a little more solid than the Mercedes does. Same storyline here, although there's a little more gap right in here. So yes, this car does have all-wheel drive, as does the Mercedes-Benz. There's a key difference between these two cars though. This one here is all-wheel drive with the primary drive at the rear with a little extra assist up front. And this one here is primarily a front-wheel drive with a little extra assist to the rear. So it's a little bit of a different detail there. So let's start off by saying clearly the Mercedes-Benz has a little finer detail. There's a little nicer materials on the outside, although everything feels a little more dainty and a little detailed. So it's a little more fragile as well. Does that translate through to the mechanics, and does that translate to reliability? Well, before we talk about reliability, I do want to talk about some of the factors that the average Mercedes like this, the C300, which actually has a turbo 4-cylinder engine, which makes about 242 horsepower, and we'll get to that and we'll listen to that in a bit. Toyota over here actually has a 4-cylinder, but 2.5 liter naturally aspirated. That means no turbos. And there's lots of people that have run these vehicles 200,000-300,000 miles. So the Toyota will likely last a lot longer than most Mercedes, but it's not necessarily chalked up to reliability. A lot of that has to do with cost of service and maintenance. If a car like this gets older, it starts to get expensive. The materials, the parts are more pricey. The service shop rates are more pricey. And the Toyota Camry shop rates are cheaper. Oil service for this vehicle here is $80. Oil service for this vehicle here is a lot more. We're paying about $250, $300 for an oil change. They have the AB services here, so they alternate every other year, and those services are costly, anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a year, whereas this vehicle here, standard maintenance, only going to run you on average, $150 to $200 a year when you spread it out between batteries, brakes, and tires. So the Toyota is going to be a lot more cost effective than the Mercedes-Benz, and that's part of the reason why it might actually last longer than this car here. However, we're not talking about necessarily long lasting, we're talking about reliability. Let's take a look inside the vehicle now too and compare the two. So first of all, in the Mercedes, we have these retractable seat belts. So this is a point of wear. There's a little complexity added in here. You don't need this. Why do you do stuff like this? But it's these little conveniences that make it a luxury car, but they also are points of failure. So this part here can go at some point. Now we look over here, we have a lot more complex seating controls, fancy buttons. It all looks great, but it's what's behind that really matters. Are these parts actually built to last the lifetime? Now, I will have to point out this speaker here. So again, fit and finish isn't necessarily the highest quality here. When we hit that set of train tracks a year ago and that body panel actually popped off, this speaker right here actually also popped out. It's a very odd thing to happen, but when we hit these train tracks and they weren't even that hard, this actually popped into the door panel. That's right, this actually went into the cavity, and we had to actually get the dealer to pull the body panel apart, pull us through and refasten it because this actually caved in. Very odd thing to happen. And right here, as we see, this fully retracted again. So you've got, as I said originally, a lot of moving parts waiting to fail. Of course, this here, you have some great detail. There's nothing overly complex, but again, it's what's behind that actually matters. Mercedes-Benz like this creates a lot of technology. They put a lot of computing power in these vehicles because they have a lot more tech going on than most vehicles. And as a result, there's a higher probability of some sort of failure. There's more modules to fail. That's not poorly put together. This is a nice finish right here. We have this beautiful piano glass finishing right here. Very nice, but again, it's a wear point. It doesn't look great after you scratch it and use it too much. Of course, these buttons, very tactile. Listen. How about this? How about this? Or little panels. Look at that nice soft open and close it. And we also have a soft open right there as well. Very nice. So overall, it's a very nicely put together area, but I do have to wonder about the fragility of these vehicles because, as I said, I've already experienced that actually popping out. So there's a lot of electronics. There's a lot more going on in here than you'd find in the Toyota. And as a result of that, there's a high probability some of these parts are going to fail. So if you're going to have some electronic components let go in this vehicle, you're likely going to pay a lot of money. And remember, shop rates on these vehicles are going to be a lot higher. And we're talking $180 to $200 an hour to get this vehicle serviced. Is that reliability concern? Is it not? Well, let's take a look at the Toyota interior. It's a little sloppier than it feels like in the Mercedes. The Mercedes does feel a little tighter. Now we have a lot of plastic in here. Now you'll notice first off, no retractable anything, pretty standard hardware there. You don't have all that complex seating controls here. Everything's fairly simple. Yeah, you have all the power windows, but it's very simple. And these are buttons that have been used for many, many years by Toyota. You'll find buttons like this in 4Runners, Camrys, Corollas. And while that might feel a little bit cheap, it does actually reliably work time and time again. It will likely never fail. Of course, down here, we do have power seat controls, as you see here. We can activate some of that. And these controls are very simple. It's incorporated in the seat. You don't have extra wiring that has to go up to the door panel. That in itself, by running switches and buttons onto the doors, can actually create other issues because now you have wiring that has to go from A to B or it has to go to a relay and back. And so by having things just down on the seat, it's an all-encompassing piece of hardware, and so you're likely to see less failure right here. Of course, the Toyota brand is known for reliability. And all of the parts that they use aren't necessarily fancy, but they work very well. The buttons are very quiet. They're not as tactile as you're finding in the Mercedes. The Mercedes, they feel there's more of a definite click. These are very subtle and quiet, and you almost can't even feel the click, which isn't necessarily the most inspiring, but it's not a failure mode. This car does not experience typical failures in here, so clearly these switches are adequate. Now compare this to the Benz. Does feel a little cheaper. How about this? A little more basic. Again, a little less tactile, a little less creamy, silky smooth, but it works. A little bit of creaking and movement in this. And then we look down here. A little bit of movement in the console here. And then we slide back here. And so it's not that soft open, it's a lot more basic, although there's a little bit of a spring load to it, but it's a lot simpler. Likely less to go wrong here, so it doesn't typically fail. And I had a Mercedes ML500 many years ago. And you know, all those little soft open, soft close, all those great features are wonderful when they're new. And believe me, they're great. But when they start to fail, and you got to go down to the dealer and you have to go buy something that is actually a relatively nickel and dime part, like an ashtray door or something like this. A part like this should be pretty straightforward. But you go into a Mercedes dealer and they'll say, well, we have to order the whole part. It's got to come from Germany. And next thing you know, you're paying $900 for a simple little part like this. Whereas in a Toyota, it just doesn't fail. And even if it did, it would probably cost you $65. That's a big part of what I do believe is going to impact reliability. Toyota just keeps it simple. Parts aren't necessarily dressed up. They're not necessarily the most beautiful functioning. They aren't necessarily the slickest operating, but they work and they don't break very often. Whereas the Mercedes-Benz, everything works wonderfully for the first 4 or 5 years. And that's where things get interesting. So then we talk about what's under the hood, because that's really a big part of what controls the reliability. Now, first of all, let's talk about the transmissions. ACEN transmission. So we have an automatic torque converter transmission over in the Toyota. Ruthlessly reliable. There's no typical issues in there, although there have been some issues with the CVTs in some of the smaller cars that they run, but generally speaking, that torque converter transmission that you find in Toyota, quite reliable. Mercedes-Benz, no real known issues with the Mercedes transmission here. However, you've got to know if there's going to be significant costs associated. Now, I will comment that we've had this vehicle and it started generating a little bit of a strange noise coming from the front end. Now, I've done some research as well as on the forums, and some people are saying there's a bearing in your gearbox or your transaxle in the front end or some part like that that can actually start to wear and make some squealing noise. And I haven't checked it. We took this to the dealer twice now and they say, oh, it's nothing, it's tires, but it's not tires. I've lost confidence and faith in the local dealers to be able to service this, and I do suspect there may be something developing in the transmission, hard to say. Other than that, there's not a lot of consistent chronic reliability issues with the transmission. Now we'll talk about the engine. Mercedes-Benz actually uses a lot of hoses like this. Well, what is this? Look, it's got plastic parts, so it snaps into a spot. See, it's got all these plastic ends like this. Well, these parts crack. You know, look, they split in the cold weather, and as you can see, we got snow on the ground, so these parts split. And then guess what? This stuff is junk after not too long. And the problem is Mercedes-Benz overcomplicates, just like BMW. German engineering is absolutely a disaster in some cases because they use relays on relays on relays, modules on modules on modules, and even in the engine bay, they use things like turbocharging. Now, everybody uses turbos, and even Lexus and Toyota are starting to adopt turbocharging in some of their latest models, and they're even finding issues, wastegate problems, and the like. This car here features a 2-liter turbo engine, makes 240 horsepower, whereas the Toyota has this 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine as well. It's not working as hard. It puts out about 200 horsepower. It's not fast by any means, but it works. Everything under the hood here is actually quite simple to maintain as well. Oil services are very easy to maintain. Your belt changes are very easy to service on this vehicle. And again, there's no turbos or intercoolers or extra plumbing under the hood. And simple, no turbos means less heat, less maintenance problems, and generally it becomes very reliable because if it's easy to fix and easy to maintain, people tend to fix it. However, the Mercedes, right here, as you can see, sure, the oil service isn't all that bad. There's your filler and there's your check, obviously your dipstick. And then, of course, you have some other body panels here. You have your brake fluid here, as well as you cycle around. Now we're talking intercoolers, so we have extra plumbing here. We also have a turbocharger that you can't even see, let alone replace it. It's tucked way down in there, so that becomes a problem. It generates heat and puts that heat into that side of the engine, which is not really where you want it. Flimsy. So this is what you get in modern day Mercedes, right here. Flimsy parts that just get loose and sloppy with a few times where you actually have to change your filters. You take this on and off a couple of times and then these little plastic tabs start to round off and then this thing just doesn't hold together anymore. Mercedes-Benz also uses these hoses, just like that other hose I showed you, where it's a snap fitting. And like this here, as you can see, this is a snap fitting here with the plastic fitting. And of course, you got that metal ring to lock it and secure it in place. And those types of hoses exist all over under the hood. They're great for manufacturing, which means this: money in the pocket for the vendor. They're going to charge you for that at the parts store. But not only that, it's going to be much faster on the assembly line to get those parts installed than on the Toyota. Although it might only be an extra 2 seconds, the fact remains is when you're doing tens of hundreds of thousands of these in a production line, it saves time, saves money. But you, at the end of the line, pay the price. Before we roll into the ratings, we're going to do a cold start of each one of these engines, the Toyota Camry, as well as the Mercedes-Benz C300 here. I just have to remind you, another big impact to overall reliability is just the simplicity and the fact of change and frequency of change. You know, Mercedes-Benz is always about innovating. They want to create something that's new and fresh, hit the numbers, make it more efficient, more powerful, quicker, more entertaining, and more interesting. Whereas the Toyotas, they're less concerned about that. They're more about the function leads the whole program, and they just want something that's going to get you from A to B reliably with little muss, little fuss. The Toyota has always been built a little simpler. The parts are a little simpler. It's not quite as slick. Basically, they don't change it frequently. That 2.5 liter 4-cylinder engine has been around a long time. They also have a 3.5 liter V6, a beautiful upgrade. That's been around a long time. Other than VVTi lines or possibly the odd water pump, those engines are bulletproof and they put out about 300 horse. So they actually produce more power than this Mercedes-Benz. And that's in a Toyota Camry, a fun family car. So yes, they do put down some decent performance. That one there with the SE is a little bit entry level. The LE is the literal bottom of the barrel, but the SE is there, the Sport, so it has a slicker front end, but it's just the base engine and it's still fun to drive. But let's get into the cold start. That was clearly non-climactic, pretty simplistic. Let's take a look under the hood and take a listen and see what it sounds like under here. Right there's a slight little rattling noise. That's typically the upper end valve train or fuel injector noise that you're going to hear there. That's not uncommon for most of these double overhead cam engines. Modern Euro wagons typically make a lot of these types of noises. And yeah, this is a gas engine if anybody's actually asking. Let's take a look at the Toyota over there. As you can see, that was also quite uneventful. Let's take a listen under the hood of the Toyota Camry right here with the 2.5 liter 4-cylinder. There's a little bit of a rattling noise here too. As you can hear, cold start. It's a little bit of a slight noise there, but it's consistent and it's rolling, rattling noise, very similar to the Mercedes-Benz. Actually, I would argue that this one's probably even slightly louder under the hood here. The fact remains, our Mercedes-Benz is a luxury car brand. It is made to delight the driver, to pamper you, to make you feel good, to make you feel nice when you drive this vehicle. It's going to do everything you ask it to do and more. The Toyota's a little simpler adventure. It's a little more bare bones, a little no frills. But it also gets you from A to B, so you can't argue with that. According to Consumers Reports, when you talk about overall reliability, the Mercedes-Benz falls absolutely dead last in terms of reliability, whereas the Toyota is absolutely number 1 and 2 slot with Lexus. Now with all of that said, check out right there. You're gonna love that. Toyota, Honda, which one is more reliable? Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.